Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D-like Pokemon RPG created with Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on updating our inventory scene to handle our player input, and we started connecting this to our world scene. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. So now that we've wired up our inventory scene to our world and our monster party scene, the next thing we need to do is we need to revisit our logic for our actual inventory itself. So currently in our scene, our inventory is an array of objects that represent the items the player currently has in their possession and their quantity. And so what we need to do is we need to move this logic out of our scene and over to our data manager. And then that way we can persist our item data when we save our game and load it. And we will also need to work on creating a master list of the items that will be available in our game. So currently our player's inventory should show only the items they currently have, but if you imagine there's a variety of items in the game we can get, and so we're going to need somewhere to store this data. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a JSON file, similar to like what we did for our attack objects and our animations. And this items JSON file will have all of the various items we can get in our game with the relevant metadata. And so once we do that, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll need to create some data models. So then that way we can load our item data and then have it available in our game, and then map it to our inventory items. So then that way we can do things like add our game objects here. We'll have a quantity, know how many the player has, and things like that. So to go ahead and get started with that, what we'll do is let's come into our assets folder under data. We'll go ahead and add a new file. Let's go ahead and do items.json. And so inside here, what we'll do is let's go to our text.json. I'm just going to copy this real quick. We'll paste it over. We'll get rid of our second attack. And then for our items, what we'll do is let's go ahead and copy some of our information. So we're going to have our potion for our name. And then let's go ahead and copy our description. And we'll go ahead and change this to description. And then one last thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new field and we're going to call this effect. And basically what effect is going to be used, it's going to represent what this does in our game. And so as an example with our potion, our effect is we want to go ahead and heal our monster, and we want to heal him by 30. Versus like if we had a super potion or a better potion, it would heal more than that. Versus another item that might teach our monster a move, or it might be used for allowing the player to do something in the game like run around. And so this will be our basic data model for our items JSON file. Basically for our items, we only need a little bit of metadata, but then once we load this into our game, we'll have a new data model that represents our inventory. And then that's where we'll attack in things like quantity, so we know how many the player actually has. So now that we have our new JSON file, we actually need to go ahead and load this in our game. So let's go ahead and go into our asset keys. Let's come up to where we have our data asset keys, and we'll add in a new key. And we'll go ahead and do items. And then let's jump over to our preload scene, and we're going to go ahead and load that in. So we come up to where we load in our JSON data. Let's go ahead and copy our line. And then we'll go ahead and change this to items for our key. And then for our path, it'll be our items.json file. All right, so now we updated Phaser to load in our JSON file. We need to go ahead and create some utility functions for getting this from the cache. So similarly to what we did for getting our monster's attacks, we need to go into our data utils, and we're going to create a method for getting our item based on the ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this method here, go ahead and paste it. And so instead of get monster attack, we'll do get item. And so we're going to get an item ID, and we'll need our phaser scene so we can reference our cache. And then we're going to go ahead and grab items. And then we need to go ahead and loop through our array until we find the ID that matches our item. And so just to keep this consistent, we're going to change this to item. We'll have item ID, and it matches our item ID. Oh, and this should be item ID. All right, so in addition to this method, we're going to add one more, and this is going to be used for getting multiple item IDs from our cache. And so we'll go ahead and change this to get items. We'll have an array of item IDs. And instead of trying to find an item by ID in our array, we're going to go ahead and filter down our array to return a new copy that only includes the IDs that we provide. And so to go ahead and do that, we're going to return data to reference our array. We'll use the filter method to go ahead and filter it down. And we're going to receive an item for each of our objects. And then what we need to do is we just need to see if this item's ID is in this array here. And so to do that, we'll use the sum method. So we're just going to do return. We're going to do our item IDs to reference that array. And we're going to use the sum method. And then we'll do ID. And we want to return if our ID equals our item ID for our current iteration in our loop. And then we'll go ahead and get rid of this here. And so now that we have our two methods, we actually need to go ahead and create a type definition to represent our data model. So then that we can update this from attack to be item. So let's jump over to our type definition file. And we'll come down to the bottom of our file and we'll go ahead and create our types. All right, so for our type, let's go ahead and copy our animation here. And we'll go ahead and paste that. And so this is going to be for our item that we load from our JSON file. And so for our type, it'll be an object. And so the first thing we're going to have is we're going to have our ID. And so this is going to be a number. And then we're going to go ahead and have our name, our effect, and our description. So we'll go ahead and get rid of this. And so we'll have name, we'll have effect, and we'll have description. And then for these, we'll go ahead and just do strings. And then for our effect, we actually want this to be an enum. And so we're going to want this to be a constrained set of values that we know. And so what we'll do is we're going to take an approach like we did with our direction, where we create an object to represent our various values. So I'm going to jump over to our direction.js file. Let's go ahead and copy that logic. We'll come above our item here. And so we're going to go ahead and change this to be item effect for our enum. And we'll change our variable name to be item effect. Go ahead and update our references. And then right now our only values is just going to be heal 30. And we'll go ahead and change that. We'll go ahead and update that. Then that way later on as we add more items, we could extend this data here. So then we want to go ahead and change our effect to go ahead and be our item effect. And now we have the right type. So now if we jump back over to our data utils, let's go ahead and update our values. So this is going to represent an item. And this is going to represent an item as well. And then what I'll do is I want to copy our JS doc type for our method definition. Go ahead and paste that. Go ahead and paste that. And let's just go ahead and update our references. So this is going to be item IDs. This will be a number array. And this will be item ID. And then we want to go ahead and change our return type. So we're going to go ahead and return an item, or we're going to go ahead and return an item array. Oh, and then real quick, let's come back to our type definition. Yes, we actually overrode that. So our ID should be a number. All right, and so what we'll do is let's go ahead and update our description real quick. So utility function retrieving an item object from the items JSON file. And then the ID of the item to retrieve from the items JSON file. So let's go ahead and update that. The list of IDs of the items to retrieve. And then we'll have item. All right, so now that we updated our types, let's go ahead and jump over to our data manager. And what we need to start doing now is we need to add in support for storing our inventory that the player currently has. And so for this, we'll need to know what item it is and the available quantity. And so what we're going to do is we'll come up to our state. And so for our state, we're going to need a new property to keep track of our inventory. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this here. And I'm going to go ahead and do inventory. And then for the time being, I'm just going to type this as any. And we'll come back and fix this. So then after our monsters down in our global state, let's go ahead and add in our inventory property. And so for this is going to be an array. And inside this array, it's going to be an array of objects that represent the current items we currently have. And so for testing, what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and add an object. All right, and then so for our item, this is going to be an object that represents the item that we currently have. And so when we save and load our data, the only thing we really care about is going to be the ID of the item we're currently storing or retrieving and the amount of those items that we need to store with it. And so the reason for this is similar like how we did our monster data and our attacks. We only want to store our IDs, and then that way, if I want to update the name or the description of this item, we don't have to worry about our data that's being saved being outdated and mismatching our JSON file. And so by just storing this ID, when we load in our data, we're going to grab our JSON file and we'll have the most up-to-date name and description and effect from here. And then so after our item, what we need to do is we need to keep track of our quantity. And so for our quantity, we're just going to go ahead and do 1. And then now we need to go ahead and update our data manager to have this key, and then that way we save and load that data. So let's come down to our data manager store keys. Let's go ahead and add in inventory. Then what we'll do is let's come down to our start new game method. We'll go ahead and reset our items if we reset our game. So we'll do our existing game data. We'll do our inventory. We're going to set it equal to our initial state, and we'll do our inventory. And then what we'll do is we'll come down to where we go ahead and update our data manager. And so let's copy this line here, and we'll do our inventory. And so we'll have inventory, and then we'll do data, and we'll do inventory. Then finally, our data manager data to our global state object. We just need to go ahead and update that as well. And so what we'll do is we'll do our inventory, and we're going to do this. We'll reference our store. We'll do get. And let's do our data manager store keys, and we'll do inventory. All right, so now that we update our data manager to store and retrieve our inventory data, let's come back up to our state where we define our inventory. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a type to represent this, and then that way when we reference it, we'll get the right IntelliSense for it. So if we go ahead, let's copy this array here, and we're going to jump over to our type definition file. We're going to go ahead and paste that. And that's just for reference for the time being. And so to represent this, we need to have an array. And so that's going to be our inventory. And inside our array, we're going to have various objects. And those objects are basically just going to have this item, and that's going to be an object, and we're going to have this quantity. All right, so go ahead and represent this. Let's copy our type definition for our item. And we're going to go ahead and update our name. And we're going to do base inventory item. And then so for this, we'll have an object. And for our object, the first thing we'll have is we will have item. And this is also going to be an object. Then under item, we have our ID. And so this is going to be our number. And then finally, we're going to have our quantity. And so for our quantity, that's also going to be a number. And then after we have our base object definition, we just need to define our inventory. So I'm just going to copy this here. I'm going to go ahead and paste that. And let's change this to inventory. And so under our inventory, this is going to be our type definition. It's just going to be our base inventory item, and we're going to have an array of those objects. So then let's get rid of this, and then let's jump back over to our data manager, and we'll go ahead and fix our type. So instead of any, this is going to be our inventory from our type definition. So one last thing we're going to do in our data manager is we're going to go ahead and create a utility method for retrieving our full inventory with the relevant metadata. And so currently, we're only storing just the ID of our item. And so what we're going to need to do in our inventory scene is for our array of items, we're going to need to retrieve each of those items, and we'll need to grab the relevant metadata from our items JSON file. And so instead of doing all that logic in our inventory scene, we're just going to create a utility method here in our data manager to go ahead and do that. And so what we'll go ahead and do is we'll come down below our getAnimateTextSpeed method, and we're going to make a new method. And we're just going to call this get inventory. And so for this method, we're going to need one parameter of scene so we can pass it to our data utils. And so what we're going to want to do is for each of our items, we're going to need to go ahead and grab our data utils to grab that item data. But instead of just returning that raw data, we still need to keep track of the actual quantity that's associated with that item so we can display it in that scene. And so to do this, what we're going to do is let's jump over to our type definition file. We're just going to make a new type real quick to represent this. And so for our type, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this here. Let's go ahead and paste it. And instead of having our base inventory item, we're going to go ahead and make a new type, and we're going to call this inventory item. And so our inventory item is going to be an object. And for our object, we'll have a property called item. And this is also going to be an object, but instead of being just this plain object with just the ID, we want it to actually be our item object itself. And so this object is going to have all of our properties. So it's going to have our ID, likewise here, but then we'd also have our name, effect, and description. And then we'd also have our quantity associated with that item. And so what we'll do is we'll come back to our data manager class. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and add in our JS doc types real quick. And so we're going to want our phaser 3 scene. So we'll do phaser, we'll do scene, and then we're going to go ahead and add in returns. And so for returns, we're going to go ahead and return our new inventory item type definition that we just specified, and we'll go ahead and return an array of those. So then what we'll do in our method is first, we'll go ahead and make a new array. So we'll do const items, and we'll set that equal to an empty array. We'll go ahead and add in our type real quick. And so for our type, this is going to be our inventory item array. and then we'll go ahead and return our items. So then what we want to go ahead and do is we need to take our existing inventory and then we need to loop through it. So to grab our inventory, we're going to do const, we'll do inventory, we'll set it equal to this, we'll reference our store, and we'll do the get method, and then we need to reference our data manager store keys, and we want our inventory. Then real quick, I'm just going to add in our type for that, and so this is going to be our inventory and not an array. So then for our inventory, we need to loop through our array of objects. So we'll do inventory, we'll use our for each method to go through each item, and then we will have our base item. And so for our base item, we need to go ahead and pass that ID to our data utils. And so let's make a new variable. We'll do const item, and we're going to set it equal to our data utils. And we're going to do get item. We'll pass in our scene, and we'll pass in our base item dot item.id. So then once we have our actual item data, we can go ahead and update our items array with this new data. So we'll do items, we'll do push, and we'll expect an object. And so our item is going to be equal to our item, and our quantity will be equal to our base item quantity that we pull from our data manager. All right, so now we have our get inventory method. What we're going to do is we're going to make another method for updating our inventory. Because we're going to return this specialized model to our inventory scene, we'll need a way to then take that array back in and then map that to our data that we store in our data manager. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to make a new method, and we're just going to do update inventory. And for our update inventory, we're going to expect our items. And then what we'll do is items, we're just going to copy this here, go ahead and paste it. We're going to go ahead and return nothing, so we'll just make this void. And then for our type, this will be items for our parameter, and our type will be our inventory item array. And so what we need to do here is basically we need to take this array, we need to transform it into our base inventory item array, so then we can actually store that data. And so to go ahead and do that, we're just going to do const, we'll do inventory, it's going to be equal to our items, and we'll use the map method to iterate through all of them. And so for each of our items, what we want to go ahead and do is return a new object. This new object will have item, and on item we'll have our ID, and so we'll have our item ID, and then we just need our quantity, and we'll do our item dot quantity. So then what we can do is with our array, we can go ahead and store this data. So now we'll do our store, and we'll do set, and we'll do our data manager store keys, inventory, and we will go ahead and pass in our inventory array. All right, so what we did here is we added two new utility methods to our data manager that are going to be used for mapping our base inventory data to the inventory object model we expect in our game. And the reason we added these here is there's a possibility we might need to use these in more than one location in our game. So if you can imagine, in our game, we might get items from NPCs, we might get pick up items from the ground, maybe we even get items from battle. And due to this, we need a way to update and retrieve this data outside of our inventory scene. And so if we map all of this data to our inventory scene directly, we'd have to duplicate our code. And by centralizing it in our data manager, it gives us a way to reuse this across multiple scenes and locations in our game. All right, so now we have our utility methods in our data manager. We actually need to go ahead and update our inventory scene to go ahead and grab our data from our data manager. And so what we'll do is in our init method, above our inventory, let's make a new variable. I'm going to do const, we'll do inventory, and we'll set it equal to our data manager. And we'll use our get inventory method. And we need to go ahead and pass in our current scene. And so what this is going to do, this is going to return us an array of our inventory objects. And what we need to do is we need to take that array and we need to add some additional data to it. So currently in our inventory, we need to keep track of the game objects that are created for each of our inventory items. And then that way we can go ahead and update them as we make changes in our game. And so to go ahead and do this, we're going to go ahead and loop through this array here and return a new array with a new structure. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment this out real quick, and we'll come down, and what we'll do is we'll come down below it. And so we're going to do this, we'll do our inventory. We're going to set equal to our inventory that we just created. We'll use the map method to go ahead and create a new array. And then so on our map method, we're going to have our inventory item. And so for each of our inventory items, what we want to do is return a new object. And on this object, we need to go ahead and return our item. So we'll have item. We'll set that equal to our inventory item dot item. We'll need our quantity. And so we'll add that. And we'll do our inventory item, do quantity. And then we want our game objects. And so we'll add in a new property. We'll do game objects, and we'll set that equal to an object. So then what we're going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to go ahead and add in our type definition for this new structure. So I'm going to go ahead and paste over some code real quick. And so what I just added here is this is a couple custom type definitions to represent our object. And so what we're going to do is this custom inventory, we're going to go ahead and set our type on our inventory to be equal to this type. And let's go over this in 1 second. And so we're going to change this to custom inventory. And so basically custom inventory, this is just an array of objects, and it's this new type inventory item with game objects. And so this inventory item with game objects is basically just an object of our inventory item. And so that means it's going to have our item and our quantity for our object. And it's going to have an additional property of game objects. And so if we come back down to our code real quick, we'll see that's exactly what we're doing here. We have our item, and so on our item, we have our item data, and then we also have our quantity, and then we have our game objects here. And then so this game objects is basically this type up here, and it just has these 3 fields. So we have our item name, our quantity sign, and our quantity, and these are just our 3-phaser game objects we've created before. And so with our new code, what we need to do is we need to update some references down here when we grab our references to our item. So instead of our inventory item.name, it's going to be our inventory item.item.name. And so for our quantity, we just need to make this into a string. And so I'm going to do, let's make it into a temperate literal. And then if we come down here where we have our description, this will be our item and then our description. All right, so with our changes, we should be able to go ahead and test our game. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go into our preload scene, and we're going to change our starting scene. So I'm going to go ahead and go to our title scene. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose new game. And so this should reset all of our data that's tied to our data manager. And so now if we go ahead and go into our bag should appear, and we should see our potion with our quantity of 1, and we should see our description. So if we want to go ahead and just test this, what we can do is let's go ahead and come to our data manager. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. We'll make another item. And so real quick, I'm just going to change this ID to 2, and we'll change our quantity to 5. And then what we'll do is let's go into our items JSON file. I'm going to copy this real quick, and we'll change this to 2. We'll go ahead and just do potion 2, and we'll go ahead and save. So now in our game, if we go ahead and go into our inventory, we should see our 2 different potion types with their different quantities. All right, so then real quick, I'm just going to go ahead and erase that data that I added. All right, with that actually brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to work on updating our UI to actually allow us to use items. And so we'll go ahead and actually use our item to heal our monster, and we'll update our data manager to go ahead and remove that item. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.